So my topic tonight is going to be the selection of replacement heifers. And, I realize we've already talked about genetics. And so you might think, well, haven't we already covered selection? And I think about it maybe a little bit differently when it comes to selection of heifers, because I don't necessarily mean in this case the most genetically elite heifers. What I mean is really selection of profitable replacement heifers, particularly with a commercial perspective. So I'm going to give you a little bit of that perspective, and then also talk about some of the tools that I think we have reproductively to select profitable females. So first, some big picture stuff. We all want to make a dollar at this, right? And who are the people that are actually doing that? And I think it's worth thinking about what are they doing, and then trying to be like them. So there's a nice set of data that the Kansas Farm Management Association puts together every year, or the KFMA, and this is some data from 2012 to 2016. And so we might have some different costs of certain inputs than we did that stretch of years. I'll grant you that. But I think there's a big takeaway here, and that's that high profit producers, if you look at just those that were in the high third for profit, which in this case is being expressed as return over variable costs. Without being too technical, what did they do compared to all farms, and especially compared to that that low third of farms? Well, they drove income up, right? And often we talk about tools that maybe are intended to drive income up. But another big thing they did is they drove costs down. And they did both of those things at the same time. So how is that possible? Often we I think buy into this false premise that we have to either be a lowest cost of production producer, a quote unquote low input producer, and then produce a low quality product, or we have to use every input we can find and produce a really high value profit. And there's really no in between or no way to do both. And I think if you've taken anything away from Dr. Decker or Dr. Bailey tonight, I hope it's that we got some really wise tools to be profitable, and really wise investments that we need to be using. And then we've also got some really wise cost reduction strategies, particularly on the feeding side. And so how do we do this? So first of all, how do we get paid? A lot of our decisions, I think, are not necessarily driven by business, thinking often in the cow-calf business. And so we get paid this way, right? It's the total value of the calf at weaning from a cow-calf perspective, minus the total, direct costs of that cow exposed. And that gives us our margin. And that's how we really ought to think about the potential value of certain animals. It doesn't tell you whether your operation's profitable, because we might have overhead costs that are out of control, but this is how we would think about individual animals and trying to identify animals that we can select that really might lead to a profitable enterprise. So whatever management that we have to do, just from a big picture perspective, before we dive into repro, it has to bring up total value of calf wean, or it has to drive down total direct costs of the cows exposed, or it has to do some combination of those two things. And I think that's the perspective that I have, and I think that's the perspective that Dr. Decker and Dr. Bailey have as well. When it comes to genetics and nutrition and general management. So the challenge to Missouri and U.S. beef producers is really not to just get bigger. I'm not saying there's not economies of scale, and that bigger operations aren't able to do some things better than smaller operations. Of course they are. But just getting bigger for the sake of getting bigger is really not a worthwhile goal. And there's a quote I like that, having more cows that lose money just helps you lose more money faster. And that's true, right? If the individual cows are really not profitable animals, having more of them just does more harm than good. So I see the goal as this, whether you're in Missouri or anywhere else, it's to increase the financial term would be gross margin per unit in the business, which is have cows that generate more gross margin, more profit potential. And we do that by moderating annual cow carrying costs. Feed, depreciation are the two big ones. When it comes to the heifers, we're thinking about development costs of heifers, moderating overhead costs, and that's really not so much about the gross margin piece, but the overall profitability piece. And then increasing the productivity of every unit of production, every cow. How many total pounds of calf, and better yet, how much calf value can we really produce per some sort of standard unit of a cow? And then also obviously increasing the value of that product. So not just total pounds, but what is the price that we actually get for those pounds of calf? And obviously that, genetic merit and some of the other things we've talked about here factor into that. But what's my takeaway? My takeaway is that reproduction affects a lot of that piece. It really affects cow depreciation costs. And we'll talk more about that in a second. It really affects how much pounds of calf that we produce per cow exposed, or per pound of cow exposed. And it really affects the value of those calves, even just on a per pound basis. And we'll talk more about that as we go through. So what drives a commercial cow to be profitable? Because when we talk about heifers, you don't really need heifers to have a cow herd. You need replacement females, right? So we're trying to identify cows to replace cows. We're trying to identify heifers that stand to become profitable cows. So what drives a cow to be profitable? Let's start there. So the first thing is how many calves she weans over her lifetime. A cow that weans one calf and then is open and out of the herd basically cannot be a profitable investment. A cow that weans 12 calves and stays in the herd long enough to do so, it's almost hard for her to not be a profitable investment. Unless our cow carrying costs are just extremely out of control. So how many years does she conceive, calve, and wean a calf before being culled? The second thing I think we don't think about enough at all, which is how old are her calves at weaning, right? We always think about weaning weight as if it is just a function of the genetics of those calves, or what bulls we used, or the genetics of the particular cow. And it is obviously genetics influences weaning weight, but a big driver of weaning weight of calves is the age of those calves at the time that they're weaned. In other words, when were those calves born within the calving season? And I'll show you some data on that here as we go through, but that is a big driver. Having cows that conceive early and calve early, and therefore wean older, heavier calves, that drives cows to potentially be profitable. And then lastly, obviously the quality of the calves weaned is huge. How much value do her calves capture based on, health, growth, performance, carcass merit, even things like visual appearance, depending on how you market calves. All of that matters, and that's why we have spent time talking about genetics today as well. But it does start with heifer selection. If your goal is to generate a cow herd that is really profitable, if I have to, or if I get the opportunity to reboot a cow herd, I'm going to start with you on heifer selection, or if you're not buying heifers, then bred cow selection, trying to identify females that are really going to start a system that can perpetuate itself and continue to be productive. If we mess up this part, it's really hard to take a heifer that starts behind and manage her to become a productive female. We really need to start with that heifer selection. So that's part of why we're so excited to do these workshops. Is that it really has a big return potential. So the goal is to keep early conceiving heifers that will have a low risk of calving difficulty, dystocia, and a high likelihood of conceiving early again and again for multiple years. And just as Dr. Bailey mentioned, to do that at a lower cost than the cost of purchasing heifers that are the same quality from another source. And I try to make that point every time because, frankly, a lot of us have no business developing heifers. A lot of us are better off not developing our own heifers, simply writing the check for replacement females and purchasing high quality, high information females that can become productive members of the cow herd. If you do that, you focus all your genetics towards terminal traits, buy terminal bulls, Worry less about calving these to some degree because you're not calving out heifers. It changes your selection criteria, place less selection pressure on maternal traits. There are a lot of advantages to moving entirely away from developing your own heifers. And so I would argue, if you are not independently profitable within a heifer development enterprise of your overall cattle operation, you should ditch heifer development entirely and buy replacement heifers and feel confident and comfortable doing that because that's a wise business decision. That being said, some folks are excellent heifer developers and can do it at a lower cost and generate higher quality heifers. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. So a heifer, if we had to write a job description, right, for a heifer that we're going to hire on into the cow-calf enterprise, what would that look like? Obviously, there are a few things immediately. She can't be structurally unsound. She can't be in poor health. She can't be of an extremely poor disposition. And you define whatever that line is for you. But she also has to have low likelihood of calving difficulty. We mentioned that already. So adequate pelvic area. She has to be bred to a calving bull. We can manage that with some of the considerations that Jared mentioned in terms of heifer selection or sire selection. And she has to conceive early in her first breeding season. Draw a circle around number 3 if you've got notes in front of you, because I really think this is a missing piece in how many of us think about the heifers that we select to become commercial females in a commercial cow herd. She has to conceive early in her first breeding season. It's not just if she conceives as a heifer, it's when she conceives. I'm far less worried about overall pregnancy rate at the end of the breeding season in heifers, and I'm far more concerned about how many heifers can you get to conceive early in their first breeding season. Then lastly, obviously, she has to have high genetic merit for profitable traits, and she has to have whatever visual phenotype and conformation that you are trying to generate based on maybe your marketing goals or just your preferences. Now, I rank those not because genetics doesn't matter, not because visual phenotype doesn't matter, or conformation doesn't matter, but some of those trump the others in terms of your ability to generate a profit if she's a commercial female, right? I may have a heifer that has an extremely good visual phenotype and conformation, but if she doesn't conceive early in her first breeding season, I can't capture very much value in that female. And the controversial point is also, I may have a heifer that has high genetic merit, but as a commercial female, if she doesn't conceive early in her first breeding season, that may not actually be an animal who's a profitable investment. And I may need to in fact, not retain an animal that has some admittedly genetic merit for other profitable traits simply because in a commercial setting, I can't make a profit on her. And some of those considerations obviously change in the seed stock setting, but as we think about then selecting and screening heifers, we have several different opportunities in the production cycle to do that. Birth, and that might seem like an odd one to suggest, but we'll talk through some of that data. Weaning, which I think is when most of us think about selecting heifers. And I think we need to get away from that. Heifer, I actually wrote an article for Progressive Cattle here a few months ago, and I titled it, "Selection of Replacement Heifers Does Not Happen at Weaning." And I'd encourage you to go read that if you can find it. You can probably just Google it. But selection of replacement heifers really should not happen at weaning. And unfortunately, I think that's what we often do, right? We go through the weaning pen, if you will, and we pick out often the biggest, prettiest heifers that we feel the best about. And we keep all of those and we breed them for, however long we're breeding season, and we retain everything that gets pregnant. That is not the way to have a profitable heifer development enterprise that feeds into your own commercial cow herd, and we'll talk through why. Then there's an opportunity to do a pre-breeding exam. We'll spend some time talking about that. And then my big takeaways, I think a lot of emphasis needs to be placed on selecting replacement heifers on the basis of a pregnancy diagnosis. And from my perspective, that is the time to select replacement heifers. And you could obviously pull a sample and do some genomic testing on animals anywhere along the way. And I think Jared gave you some great advice already in terms of how to make that pay. So let's talk about the pregnancy diagnosis piece. Remember that in that job description, she has to conceive early as a commercial female in order for me to feel good about her as an investment. Why do I say that? So if we look at the proportion of cows that fail to have a calf next year as a function of when they calved this year, there is a really strong relationship there. So this is some data that's expressed in terms of the days of the calving season in which those cows calve. So you see day 1 to day 20, day 21 to day 40, et cetera. And then the proportion of those cows that then fail to have a calf. In other words, they come up open. They don't calve that next year. What's that relationship, right? It's obvious. If a cow has a calf early in the calving season, she has, just like Dr. Bailey mentioned, an adequate period of time to resume cyclicity, what we call the postpartum interval. She has enough time before the start of that next breeding season to go through that postpartum period of anestrus and then resume normal estrus cycles and be ready to breed on the first day of the breeding season, or at least early on in the breeding season. But what happens if a cow calves, for example, in that day 81 to 100 column? Well, if you think through the math, right, 283 gestation, add 80 days to that, there is no way that cow is ready to breed on the first day of the breeding season, if we're managing for a breeding season and a calving season, because she hasn't had a calf yet, right? So let alone the effect of the postpartum interval. If we have these calving seasons that drag on, we don't even have calves on the ground by the time the cows are needing to breed back. I think in Missouri, we have, well, I would love to say that nobody calves all year long. And obviously we have neighbors that do exactly that. So we haven't entirely killed this. But I think among progressive producers, I think we know this is a problem. These kind of 90-day and longer calving seasons that take us out into this range. I think we know that's a problem. My message is this is also a problem. This is a huge problem because that does not allow those animals that time to go through that postpartum anestrus period and be ready to breed at the beginning. And if you select a heifer that in year 1 is right here and calves that late in her first calving season, she's going to fall out of the herd faster. And we should have known this for a long time. This is a 1958 paper, but here's some more recent data. This is some data. This is actually out of a paper that uses a couple of different data sources. One is from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center. One is from some commercial herds in South Dakota, and this is the commercial data set off of commercial, real world operations in the Dakotas. And this was put together in 2013, and what it shows is the effect of a heifer based on when she conceived in her first year. And therefore calved in her first calving season, when she calved in her first calving season. And then it just shows the proportion of those heifers that remain in the herd in successive years. Okay, so the black line here with the diamonds is the heifers that conceived in the first 21 days of their first breeding season. Therefore, they calve in the first 21 days of their first calving season. And then the dashed line with the squares is the heifers that conceived day 23 and after. So after that point. Now what happens in that first year? So this will be essentially a first calf heifer that we're asking to breed back, right? That's what that is. If we just look at the heifers that conceived that first year and calve that first year, if we look at those first calf heifers that we asked to breed back, what happens? Well, those later calving first calf heifers, we get a lower breed up in those heifers. We have more of those heifers open that year. Okay, we know that. We know it's a challenge to breed first calf heifers. Now what happens when they're 3-year-olds? The exact same thing. In fact, if anything, in these commercial herds, it's worse. It's even exacerbated that year. So we've slipped a little bit, and then we continue to slip. And what happens? We continue to slip, and we continue to slip. And if you look at how quickly those cows fall out of the herd, just as a function of when they conceived as heifers, there's a tremendous proportion of those heifers that is gone, that we invested all of that development cost in, and they did not even produce 4 calves. Okay. If you look at the average number of calves that are produced by a commercial cow in the United States, it is terrifyingly low, if you're honest about the numbers. There's an old rule of thumb, right, that it takes 4 to 5 calves out of a cow before she's quote unquote paid for herself, right? It's scary that we are in most cases not actually doing that. It's actually closer to 3. Okay, so here's that in just a different way. A 60-day breeding season, what I would call a fairly well-managed breeding season, right? Many of us have much longer breeding seasons, and the 60 days is essentially 3 estrus cycles, a little shorter than that. So 283-day gestation, that animal that conceives on the first day of the breeding season, calves on the first day of the calving season, what happens? She's not cycling for some of that rest of the calving season, but who cares? We're not asking her to breed back then, right? But assuming that we've taken care of the nutritional piece, she's calved at a good body condition score, management is adequate, she is ready to go at the start of that breeding season, and she essentially is going to have 2 to 3 opportunities, even with no synchronization or no artificial insemination. She ought to have 2 to 3 opportunities to get serviced by a natural service bull in that breeding season. Now consider, though, the heifer that even in a well-managed breeding season, what we might call a well-managed breeding season, 60 days, if she conceives on the last day of that breeding season, calves on the last day of that breeding season, what happens in her case? Some of that next breeding season, she's not ready to go. And that's particularly the case if we challenged her and calved her at a low body condition, right? If we did anything else management-wise to complicate that, we exacerbate that problem. But even for the well-managed animal, how many opportunities does she have here? Maybe 2, probably more like 1. In some cases, maybe she might get unlucky and not even have 1, particularly if that management is challenging her in some other way. Now, this plays out in the real world. Okay, so this is some data in terms of the reproductive performance of a cow herd over successive years. And the left side is some data that Dave Patterson, who's my predecessor at MU as the state beef reproduction specialist, was here for a number of years, had a very prolific career and had a wonderful impact on this state. This is some data at a research center that he did a lot of work at, the Thompson Research Center in Northwest Missouri, a little town called Spickard. And as they, in that herd, moved from only natural service, which is the red line, to using estrus detection and AI followed by natural service, and then to using fixed time AI and then following that with natural service. What happened? Well, this is the proportion of those calves that are born by a certain day of the calving season. So I'm going to pick out, day 20-ish in here. What do we see? In this natural service treatment, these are cows that are only exposed to bulls. Well, they had about 60% of those calves born by day 20 of the calving season. Now, I want to make a point. That is phenomenal. Actually, that is very successful reproductive management. If you're in that range of calves that are born in essentially the first 20 days, that's excellent. Most of us are not close to that if we're not doing some kind of reproductive management, or we're using very short calving seasons or something like that. But what happens then when they begin using estrus synchronization, detecting estrus and performing AI? All of a sudden, you see that line shifts to the left, right? So it's tempting to look up here at the overall, pregnancy rate and go, it doesn't make a difference, right? The same proportion got pregnant. But when they became pregnant, makes a huge difference, because every bit of area between this line is essentially additional calf age. An additional calf age, an additional day of calf age is about 2.2 pounds, depending on the, steer, heifer, growth genetics of that calf. That's about what those calves gain from birth to weaning. And so when you start shifting these lines to the left, aside from, the fact that now a lot of these calves are AI sired, ought to theoretically be of pretty high genetic merit. Aside from all of that, just think of the value that's added with calf age. Now you see the same thing over here on the right side of the screen. Cliff Lim is a reproductive physiologist now, the department head at Texas A&M. And when he was at the University of Florida, managed a research center in the Panhandle, a little town called Marietta. And at that research center, Cliff did an excellent job moving them towards use of estrus synchronization and fixed time artificial insemination, and did it, in a pretty interesting way. Grouped cows into different groups and selectively tried to cull late calving cows. Did a lot of things here. There's more here than just synchronization. But it makes the point, right? If you look at these first 2 years in which they were only natural service, and then look at just the immediate impact of beginning to do some form of reproductive management, a little bit of culling, a little bit of use of synchronization, maybe a little bit wiser heifer selection. What happened? They shifted when calves were born and had more calves born early. So that's just the average day at which calves are born. They brought that down. And that resulted in an increase per calf value. So that's great, right? We went from 80 to 60-ish. But look what happens when they stuck with that for, in this case, 6 years. Look how that positive snowball effect continued to build, right? This is that snowball going down the hill, catching a little snow on top of it. I don't know why I'm talking about snow when it's the middle of November and it feels like this in the state of Missouri, but you get the point, right? We're starting up a cascading, compounding effect that is a really beneficial opportunity. Okay, so just to make the point a little bit differently, some of that data in terms of calf value as a result of when calves were born during the calving season. This is those heifers, so that first calf out of those heifers that conceived early and calved early in their first calving season, that's that black bar, versus those that conceived in the next estrus cycle, the gray bar, versus the next estrus cycle, the white bar. So what happens? Well, obviously their first calf is heavier, right? Because that calf is older. But what happens for the calves of those heifers moving forward? Well, you see that early conceiving heifer actually weaned a heavier calf next year too, and next year, and next year, and next year, and next year, right? So if you add that up, it ends up being about an additional calf that's weaned. And then also remember that heifer stayed in the herd longer. And she actually, in this data, weans about 1.2 more calves. So she weans 1.2 more calves, and she weans about an additional calf worth of weaning weight over just those first 6 years. Okay, I think that makes the point. Early conceiving heifers are valuable commercial females, and later conceiving heifers are inherently just less valuable. So now the question becomes, well, is there a way to prospectively, in other words, in advance, select those heifers instead of just retrospectively, instead of just doing a pregnancy diagnosis and seeing when they became pregnant? The answer is yes. And again, remember the goals. The goal is early conceiving, low risk of dystocia, so low risk of calving difficulty, high likelihood of conceiving early again, and to do it at a lower cost. So I always say that if a heifer hasn't done this yet, she's not a replacement heifer. She's a replacement candidate. And we have some candidates that are better than others. And here's how I think about identifying this. The first thing is at birth. Okay, if a heifer is born early in the calving season herself, so a heifer calf that was born early in the calving season, retained as a heifer, those early born heifer calves remain in the herd longer. Now, obviously that's happening because they conceive earlier. Okay, so if you do a pregnancy diagnosis, you're going to sort some of this out anyway. But if you're trying to identify the heifer calves to potentially develop and breed, this should drive the point home that you ought not go through a pen of heifers and just pull out the biggest, prettiest heifer calves at weaning, because you're just pulling out big heifers. You ought to be on paper identifying the heifer calves that were born early in the calving season. And I'm not saying early in the calendar year. I'm not saying, identify all the heifers born in January or something like that. But within your calving season, if you're fall calving and you start calving in September, identify those heifers that are being born in, I would say often, at least the first half of your calving season, and try to think about selecting or developing that pool of heifer calves as a pool of replacement heifer candidates. I'm not saying your oldest half of your heifers, but those heifers that are born in the first half of your calving season, especially if you're using a longer calving season. So if you calve for 90 days, for example, those heifer calves that are born in the first 45 days still should be well over half of your heifers. Or we have some other problems to deal with. But those are the heifer calves that really have some potential value as a candidate to develop. Now, the effect of the time of birth, of those heifers We see that exact same kind of relationship with the weaning weight of their heifers. And I think I've made that point, so I'm going to skip through this. Again, it is just because of when they conceive. Those heifers that were born in the first 21 days of their calving season, well, what happens? Most of them are cycling at the start of their first breeding season. This is some data, again, from Rick Funston's group up in Nebraska. Most of them, as a function of being cyclic at the start of the first breeding season, most of them go on to conceive pretty early in that first breeding season, calve early in their first calving season. And you see this negative stair-step relationship, right? Where those heifers that were just born 21 days later, that's just 3 weeks, right? That doesn't seem like all that big of a span of time, but it matters. We pick it up in the literature, right? Where those heifers that are younger, even if it's just 3 weeks younger, fewer of them are cycling at the start of their first breeding season, fewer of them get pregnant early, and fewer of them calve early, and therefore they're less profitable commercial females. And that obviously gets worse and worse as you have a longer calving season. So I think that makes the point about calving seasons. Okay, I kind of have my talk divided into two as well. And so I think I'm just going to roll right into the next one. We'll do some questions at the end, but the other piece about when to select replacement heifers or when to screen replacement heifers, if you're not doing a pre-breeding evaluation on heifers, I think this is something at least to consider. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that is. So the major things to keep in mind are the components of a pelvic screening and why we do that, and then a reproductive tract evaluation. And then just thinking about it as an opportunity to do some other things, overlay some other services, screen for some other features that you want to watch for. And then also using that information, not just to think about the heifers, but to think about what it tells you about your own practices. We've talked about this already, but this is what we're looking at a pre-breeding evaluation. It's an opportunity to look at number one, look at number two, and really identify prospectively those heifers that have some chance at becoming pregnant early in their first breeding season. So often this would be done about 30 to 60 days before breeding. If you're using a protocol like a 14-day CEDAR protocol on heifers, which is a great strategy to use, this could occur at the time of CEDAR insertion. There are two big components we'll talk about. So one is pelvic measurement and one is tract scoring. So in terms of pelvic measurement, this is often going to be done by a veterinarian using a rice pelvimeter, and that's what this is. This is inserted into the rectum of the animal, and then the veterinarian, along with having his hand in the animal, is going to expand that pelvimeter. I'll play it one more time. And it's going to go from here, we call the pubic symphysis, up to the sacral vertebrae, and then at the widest point of what we call the ilial shafts. Okay, and so that's going to be a height measurement and then a width measurement. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, if I take, for example, a height of 13.5 centimeters and a width of 11.5 centimeters, the convention is to just multiply those together and get an area. So there's a lot of research, and we're not going to go deep into the weeds here, but there's a lot of research that very clearly ties pelvic area and calf birth weight together and shows a relationship between calving difficulty, calf birth weight, and size of that pelvic area. Now, you cannot just get an indication about whether a heifer is an easy, calving heifer or has innate pelvic area just by looking at the external measurements of a heifer. You can't measure, for example, from pin to pin, or you can't measure just the width of some feature on a heifer and get an idea about pelvic area. That's not well correlated with calving difficulty. It's really thorough research has been done in Eastern Montana back in the 80s at the USDA center up there to look at the relationship. And there's a very strong relationship between pelvic area and calving difficulty. Now, the old way of doing this involved a lot of mathematic calculations. You take that pelvic area, you think about how big the heifer was, and you calculate out how big of a calf could she deliver. And frankly, we're kind of past that. Now, I put it in here for reference, but this is probably not how you're going to approach calving difficulty, and it's not how I would suggest using pelvic area information. Instead, just think of pelvic measurement as a screening tool. And it's a screening tool to evaluate heifers that are unacceptably small so that you can cull those heifers out of the program. So for example, you might have a minimum requirement that those heifers have to reach in our Show Me Select Replacement Heifer program. That's 150 square centimeters at the time of that pre-breeding exam. And if heifers fail to meet that, what do you do? So let's say this particular heifer had a height of 12 and a width of 10. That's a fairly small pelvis. Oftentimes a veterinarian might put his or her hand in and be able to tell you that's small before he or she actually needed to use a pelvimeter. So what do you do with an animal like that? Well, a veterinarian is probably going to give you some good advice and say, you know, if that heifer, based on her reproductive tract score, has not yet hit puberty again, it's probably wise to remeasure her later on, say at a pregnancy diagnosis. And if she became pregnant, you know, we are going to demand that she has an even larger pelvic area at that time. For example, in Show Me Select, she would need to be remeasured and have a 180 square centimeter pelvic area at that time. And then if she has hit puberty, you know that, but she still has that very small pelvis, that's an animal that you really probably ought to think about culling. And it's certainly an animal to recheck either way. And if you have plenty of heifers, or if it's maybe a commercial heifer development operation where you're trying to minimize risk and get rid of some potential problem animals, that may be a heifer that you just choose to cull because of the fact that she missed that first minimum. The other piece is, you know, consider the group as a whole. I've just recently done a lot of these and worked with a couple operations in particular that intentionally try to have very small frame, very moderate size animals, and those pelvic areas are consistently on the low side, and we just know that is part of that group's kind of characteristics, and that selection for cavities is particularly important in selecting sires that get used on heifers like that. So you do have to consider some of those group things as a whole, and your veterinarian can help you think through how to use this information. But having that as a screening tool really is helpful for getting some heifers out of the system that are just guaranteed problem, what I call problem children, right? It's not going to control for everything. You can still get abnormal presentations. This doesn't tell you anything about that. And then it also is not any kind of license to then say, well, I can use whatever cavities type of, or not cavities genetics on heifers that I want to, because they all had acceptable pelvises. No. Don't think about it like that. It's still extremely critical to select for cavities and select sires that meet a certain level of cavities to use in heifers. The other piece of a reproductive exam or pre-breeding exam, and why you might consider this in a heifer development program, is that we can actually tell if the heifer has attained puberty just by doing a palpation of that heifer. And so I think it's been made clear already that we want heifers to conceive early in their first breeding season, and really to do that, we need her to reach puberty before the start of her first breeding season. That's part of why synchronization programs are so effective. In particularly programs like the 14-day cedar, is we can get some of those heifers to reach puberty and be cycling at the start of her first breeding season. But we also want them to be cycling in advance of their first breeding season, if at all possible. This gets into the weeds a little bit, but the literature is conflicted a little bit on whether fertility of heifers is lowest at their very first pubertal estrus versus in later estruses. But even in the studies in which there hasn't been a very obvious relationship there, it's still very clear that those heifers that reach puberty well in advance of the start of their breeding season, they're cycling already. It's not their very first estrus that they are bred on. Those heifers get pregnant early, and they have high breed back success in the next year. And so that is really important. We want heifers not only cycling, but really cycling in advance of the start of the first breeding season, so that we're not asking them to be bred on their first pubertal estrus. Now, puberty is all about taking off the brake. And this is what I would really go through with, a reproductive physiology class. We'd walk through all of these these hormonal relationships and try to talk through this. But the main thing is just to keep in mind that puberty is controlled at the level of the brain. And the brain at the level of the hypothalamus is taking in a lot of inputs, a lot of signals. And the signal of a break on puberty attainment, a break on cycling behavior, on hormonal feedback associated with starting cyclicity, that break has to come off for puberty attainment to happen. And so management of nutrition to allow that break to come off, management for relatively low stress in an operation is really critical to allow that break to come off. And age is really critical to allow that break to come off. And we got to have all of those things and more going in the right direction, or we have a break on puberty attainment that is really challenging to lift. So again, not going to wade through all of the hormonal relationships tonight, but basically with a reproductive tract scoring system, we go in and evaluate the ovaries based on the structures present on those ovaries, and we get an indication of where this animal is at in terms of that break coming off. And so if I go in and I palpate an animal that has a very small set of ovaries with no follicular development whatsoever, I know that break on puberty attainment is on and pressed down to the floor. Okay. If I go in and I begin to palpate slightly larger ovaries and there's a little bit more follicular development, that break is starting to come off, and I can assign a score that essentially represents how far away she is from attaining puberty. And so a tract score 2, for example, is an animal that hasn't reached puberty yet and is well over at least over 30 days from attaining puberty, and potentially well over 30 days. A tract score 3 is an animal where that breaks off a little bit. We're coasting in the right direction a little bit, albeit slowly. Like my grandpa that always used to drive with his foot constantly on the brake. It's kind of that situation, right? We're not going fast yet. We haven't reached puberty yet, but I'm beginning to see some mid-level follicles, and really it ought to be in about the next 30 days in which that animal ought to attain puberty. Tract score 4 is an animal that, based on what the uterus is doing and how it's coiled and the large follicle present on the ovary, I know that break is off and she's cycling. And a tract score 5 is an animal that is also cycling, but she has a certain structure on her ovary, corpus luteum, that indicates she has indeed ovulated and had a pubertal estrus event already. So that's that system, and it's really a tool to directly assess reproductive development in heifers. I think we've talked through it already in enough detail. If you want quantitative measurements, I included some of those in your set of slides tonight, and you're welcome to look through those. The main takeaways, though, is just that this can inform your selection of heifers, because it's a really good indicator for pregnancy rates to fixed time AI. It's a really good indicator for when a heifer becomes pregnant within the breeding season, really good indicator for what kind of weaning weight she's going to produce because of when she became pregnant. And here's some data from our Show Me Select program. This has about 43,000 heifers in it from all across the state of Missouri, all real world operations. And you see that stair-step relationship, right? It's pretty obvious that there's no reason to try to do a fixed time AI on tract score 1 heifers and to put them through a program like these are automatic, stalker heifers or heifers that need to be finished out. Tract score 2 and 3 heifers, you see again that stair-step relationship. Whether those twos, maybe there's a profitable strategy to use for those that maybe doesn't involve breeding them, or maybe you take that chance and you get that 27% that does conceive. It's a business decision. Tract score 3s often do quite well. Again, we would expect them to. And tract score 4s and 5s, the cycling females obviously do quite good. Again, this is real world, commercial pregnancy rates to fixed time. Yeah. And so this can be a great tool just to learn about the cyclicity in a group of heifers. So if half of them aren't cycling, that's a red flag. And then we start thinking about, well, what's the nutrition program? What's the age variation? Is there a parasite issue? Are there some sire group differences? Do I even know the source of these heifers? Are there mixed sources? Do I know if they were implanted or something like that? I can begin to ask those kinds of questions and get to the bottom maybe of some situations that if I don't do this, I just only have pregnancy information to go off of. So I also included a set of information just to show you what pre-breeding examination data would look like if you got that information on a set of heifers. This is from the Southwest Research Center a couple of years ago, 40 heifers. We did this at the time that Cedars went in on a 14-day Cedar protocol and gave booster vaccinations. And here's what it looked like, right? This is fairly typical results. The proportion that were infantile had a Tract score 1, proportion that were 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, etc. The weights of those heifers and pelvic areas. A couple things are good. We have half of them cycling. That's great. But we also have some problems, right? We had some smaller pelvic areas. And when you have this kind of information, you can start to go through it in ways like this. Well, most of the heifers with small pelvic areas weren't cycling. And so, that maybe changes my interpretation about what the problem is. I have a large proportion of these heifers, at least from my perspective, 10% of those heifers that have a Tract score 1, those heifers need to be culled. They also all had pelvic areas that were, below my cutoff, obviously. And then I can slice and dice it. If I looked at those heifers that resulted from the AI program, so, they were AI sired and also born fairly early, no problems at all, right? Those heifers were either all cyclic or all within 30 days of reaching puberty, all had a weight that for this particular cow group, I would call acceptable, and no issues about pelvic areas. And then where are the problems coming from? Well, they're coming from those heifers that are born after the first 30 days. So you remember mentioning that rule of thumb to keep those heifers that are born in the first half of the calving season. You can see that was a problem in this herd, and we've got that well turned around now, but it gives you an idea of the type of management changes that you might really be driven to make if you collect some of this information on a set of heifers. So I'd encourage you to try it out on a set of heifers that you're thinking about developing, and also remember it is a tool to identify some other problems. You might catch some heifers that are free martins, and so they have an incomplete tract. You might find some cystic heifers that need to be treated. You might find that heifers, whether they're purchased heifers and they were sold to you as opens and they're not in fact opens, or whether there's a mystery bull that jumped in and out that you had no idea of. Those things happen all the time, and you have an opportunity to catch those. And again, I identify maybe some problematic sources as well. Okay, I'm going to leave it at this. This is my final thought. Some change in your decision making has to occur if a pre-breeding exam is going to be profitable. And so that has to be either a cost reduction, so culling heifers to avoid those expenses, or increasing revenue. Maybe it leads you to make a different management decision. And that can be really a nice opportunity. And then the other thing is that context is key. So what other information can you get on the heifers? Can you slice and dice it in some ways that really help you make some of those decisions? I've probably droned on long enough. If you're interested in visiting more about this sometime, you're always welcome to give me a call. Always welcome to send me an email. My contact information is on that first slide. And you can also keep in touch with a research program if you follow the Mizzou Repro YouTube channel or Facebook page. I think we post some pretty good content video wise, and try to share some articles and things like that too. So I encourage you to keep in touch with us there.